Oh, wait, I didn't say Katie. Can you introduce yourself? You ought to be happy to talk to people here.
Well, that's not the normal introduction, Randy. You're throwing me off here.
Well, we have to change things up every once in a while. Come on.
Got to make it interesting. Well, good afternoon, everyone.
All right, good deal. Katie's going to be presenting later on. She's going to actually finish up today, so you'll hear more from her a little bit later. The first part of this topic in class is going to cover the areas shown here. I'm going to be talking about the truck and bus regulation and everything that's listed here. When I get to enforcement, Katie's going to take over there, and then she's going to finish with the SB1 enforcement tool and the greenhouse gas. And as I said before, an overview of the new and proposed regulations. Before I go any further, though, I want to make sure you're all aware of something. Even though we do give a quick primer on the proposed regulatory programs that our agency has going on right now, there is a new course that is going to be presented for the first time next Tuesday. It's called MS555, and it is a long-form version of exactly what the shorter one is we're going to do this afternoon. It's a compare and contrast between several new programs and the existing ones that they're likely to replace. In any case, if you feel like you would like to listen in on that, we can send you the registration link, but it is it's going to be a good deal, and there's quite a few people that are already registered for it. All right, so this is the topics we're going to cover. Let's get right into it. This is the truck and bus regulation. One of the things or phrases that I usually use to describe this rule is the fact that this is what I consider to be an omnibus regulation. I don't have the list here for you to look at, but prior to the truck and bus rule actually being promulgated and adopted, we had probably 15 other rules that were already in place that dealt with diesel engine technology and its uses. And each of those regulations covered a very specific sector of diesel technology use, only those sectors. When the truck and bus rule was proposed, it was more of an overall, let's catch everything else kind of rule. So it was a very broad regulation compared to some of the other ones. And as such, it was fairly complicated. So we've had more or less a hard time explaining all the requirements of this rule because it is such a broad thing. But let's get through this right now. We're so far into this rule that most of the stuff that made it complicated has already come and gone. This rule does apply to all private and federal fleets. And for purposes of this regulation, a fleet is one vehicle. If you're operating this vehicle or vehicles in California and it's running on any form of diesel fuel and has a gross vehicle weight rating of more than 14,000 pounds. We'll talk more about GVWR in just a second, but in order to fall into this rule, all three of these things have to be true. There are requirements in this rule for public and private school buses, and that's a little interesting because we specifically break them out in this rule because they were not covered, intentionally not covered by another rule prior to this. And ultimately, we felt we had to regulate the school buses because they were emitting these substances that we are worried about to one of our most sensitive populations. Anyway, we're not going to talk more about the public and private school buses in today's session. Just understand that they do have requirements that fall into this regulation. Two-engine street sweepers, any two-engine vehicle provides a little bit of a problem for us in regulatory systems because the secondary engine is almost always considered to be what's called a portable engine, and that brings in another whole set of circumstances and regulatory programs and registering and all this good stuff. So when we put the two-engine vehicle requirements out there, we put almost all of them into one of two regulations. It's either going to be in the public agency and utility rule, or it's going to be in the off-road limitation. The only type of vehicle that has two engines that didn't get put into one of those two was privately owned two-engine street sweepers. They're in this regulation. Both engines are in this regulation. Just a second ago, I was talking about the public agency and utility regulation. We do have a little bit of well, it's not an update. It's happened fairly recently, i.e. the beginning of this year. But we have a regulation that has been in place since 2005 to 2008, that was built for and written for public agencies and public utility fleets, as well as private utility fleets. One thing about that is that starting January 1st of 2021, Even though the private utilities were under the original public rule, they were broken out and brought under the auspices of the truck and bus regulations. So currently today, anybody that works or any fleet that is part of a private utility in the state of California now has to comply with the truck and bus regulation requirements. Having said that, I want to make sure you understand what a private utility is. First of all, I already said that they're part of this rule as of January 1st, and a private utility can be a privately owned company. They're very similar in what they do to the public utilities. It's just who owns them. So they're not owned by a municipality or city or some combination thereof. They're privately held companies, which one of the things I use to try and remember this is, can you buy stock in it? If you can buy stock in the company, it's probably privately owned and it becomes a private utility. So PG&E is a good example. It seems like it's a public entity, but it really isn't. For purposes of this, telecommunications have never considered utilities under the regulation and have been following the truck and bus regulation the entire time. If you have questions about this, we recommend that you call our 866 diesel number, and you'll be able to talk to somebody that has had to deal with these questions, and lots more of them, a number of times. For truck and bus, who is responsible for compliance? Well, obviously, if you own one of these vehicles, we're going to hold you responsible for its compliance. If you lease or rent a vehicle that falls under this rule, it's kind of dependent, it is dependent on how your lease or rental contract is worded. Because if it's in the lease contract that you, the leaser, are responsible for it, then you are responsible for it. If it's not, then it automatically goes to the company that owns it and is actually leasing it to you. At this point, most of the lease and rental fleets are new enough trucks that it really doesn't matter because they're in compliance. If you sell a vehicle, so under this rule, we're not telling you, and we're not telling anybody that you can't sell the vehicles that fall under this rule. And you have no requirement to make sure those vehicles are in compliance before you sell them. That's not what we've said at all. What we're saying here is that if you're going to sell a vehicle that falls under this regulation to somebody who you think might operate it in California, and that's the kicker. If they don't, you don't need to worry about this. But if you have any conceptual idea that they are going to operate that vehicle in California, then you're required to provide a sales disclosure to them in writing when you sell them that vehicle. It should be in the contract. I had this come up the other day because somebody contacted me and said that they were sold a vehicle and they did not ask for compliance information. And when they finally got around to looking, it turned out that that vehicle was not in compliance when it was sold. And so they contacted me, because I represent ARB, and asked me what we could do to help them because of this provision that sales disclosure has to be there. So I want to put this as, I don't want to say bluntly, but it really is. ARB doesn't enforce private sales. So if somebody sold you a vehicle that was not compliant and they did not provide the disclosure, yes, there is a component of this regulation that says that that was illegal. But in order to take advantage of that, you have to file a private suit against the person or company that sold you the vehicle. You have the law on your side. That disclosure requirement is there, and it is something that will help you in that case. But ARB does not work in that manner. We don't file cases against people for that kind of thing. We do look for sales disclosures whenever we audit a fleet, because if a fleet is different than what's reported, one of the things we require them to send us is information on what happened to the vehicles they have no more, and then we look at the contracts, and if it's not there, then that's part of our enforcement. Finally, on this, there's the information about our California-based brokers and dispatchers. So that is a type of entity that may or may not own any trucks whatsoever. Most of them do not own their own trucks under this rule. Most of them broker the use of other people's trucks to do different activities. And if you are hiring somebody to move something for you, you are brokering the use of that truck. It is required under this regulation that you only hire compliant fleets. So if you don't at least check that the people you're hiring to use their equipment are in compliance with this rule, it is entirely legal for ARB to cite you, the hirer, if we find that vehicle out in the field being used and it's not compliant. So just be aware of that. I think at this point also, because of the connection with DMV and registration, it's not likely to be as big a deal as it once was. But if, again, you're supposed to be hiring compliant fleets. Here's the sales disclosure that I was talking about, and it does have to be this exact language. That exact language that's quoted on the bottom has to be included on the sales paperwork, bill of sale, whatever kind of contract you use. You have to keep a copy of that contract for 3 years. And the only time it's going to come into play, for the Air Resources Board anyway, again, is if we're auditing your fleet. There are exclusions to this rule, exceptions, if you will, and there are the same type of exclusions to many of our regulations. If you are a, I don't know, emergency use type vehicle, if you have one of these, that vehicle, because it is listed and meets the definitions of emergency vehicle under the Motor Vehicle Code, it is exempt from this regulation. We also exempt emergency use of non-emergency vehicles. So if there happens to be a declaration of emergency by a municipal authority like the governor, during that particular declaration, any use of non-emergency vehicles is also exempt from the requirements of this regulation. Military tactical vehicles also have a similar exemption. The only caveat here is that we're talking about those vehicles that are either deployed or are used in direct support of deployment. So on military bases in the state of California, you'll have a lot of vehicles that are just used to support the base. They're not actually used to load the planes or to move bombs to a jet or whatever the case is. So they're not considered military tactical, and they do have requirements under this regulation. Personal use motorhomes have always had an exemption from the truck and bus rule, and they still do. One thing I will say is this picture right here that you're looking at, that creates a little bit of a problem for our enforcement teams, because you've got a semi-tractor trailer, which looks like one that would haul a regular type of trailer goods for commercial use, but it's hauling a fifth wheel. And in this case, this is a motorhome. It's being used as a motorhome. And if that was its only use, and you could demonstrate that, then it would be exempt from the requirements of this rule as well. Personal use pickup trucks. This is another issue that we have based on the way registration works in the state. I'm not sure you're aware of this, but I'll let you know that any pickup truck, no matter how small, is considered a commercial vehicle under the Motor Vehicle Code. And that's just something that's been in place for a long time. And we're trying to regulate in this particular rule all commercial use trucks over 14,000 pounds that run diesel fuel. Well, one of the mechanisms we use to do that enforcement is DMV registration information. We will access DMV, we'll draw a list of all the commercial diesel vehicles over 14,000 pounds. And unfortunately, because pickup trucks are considered commercial, they wind up being in that data. And because there's a specific exemption for all these pickup trucks, these personal use pickup trucks that are less than or equal to 19,500 pounds gross vehicle weight rating, they are caught up in this. And they're not actually under the regulatory requirements, but it looks like they are to us when we look at these lists. So in a minute, I'm going to show you a way, if you have a vehicle like this, that you can get it out of the requirement entirely. Another thing you'd be interested in knowing, one of the defining characteristics of a personal use pickup truck is that it has to have a standard pickup bed. If you have any other kind of bed, like a flat bed or stake side, or you have some commercial component to it like a Tommy lift or something like that, that is not going to be considered personal use if it has that kind of bed on it. Historic vehicles. I always find these interesting because when you see a historic truck over 14,000, usually it's cherried out like that, all the chrome is shiny, and it's only used as a show vehicle. In order to be considered exempt as a historic vehicle under this rule, the owner of that truck has to register it as a historic vehicle through DMV. And that actually has additional requirements for them if they do that, because a vehicle that's registered as historic, a truck like this, is not legal to haul goods anywhere in the state of California. It has other requirements too, but basically if you've registered it that way, it's exempt from this regulation. Also, vehicles that are subject to other in-use regulations. Now, I told you earlier that we had a whole bunch of regulations that were put in place prior to the truck and bus rule, and they were very specific to a category of use. Well, if a vehicle falls under one of those, then it's not going to fall under the truck and bus rule. We don't usually put the two regulations on the same engine for vehicles in the state of California. I'll give you an example. So if you see a truck that is hauling containers from a port or a rail yard, that's a very specific use, and that is a truck that is called a drayage truck. And prior to truck and bus being instituted, we had a drayage truck regulation that was put in place that covered any vehicle that hauls containers, even if they only do it once a year. They are part of that regulation. So because they're part of that rule, they are not part of truck and bus, at least not until January 1st of 2023 when the two rules actually combine. All right, that's the exclusions. Let's give you some information on how to remove your pickup trucks and other vehicles that you think are should be excluded from this rule. We have a completely separate database that was built on purpose to encapsulate the vehicles that are being caught up in our enforcement process that should not be. It's called the Excluded Diesel Vehicle Reporting System, or EDVR. And this is the link for it. This is what the page looks like. If you believe you have one of these vehicles that should be exempt, what you need to do is go to this page and report that truck and your information. You're going to be asked for some pictures because there has to be a demonstration that meets the definitions that I was talking about earlier, but you still should be able to get it out of the regulatory requirements of truck and bus. Okay, those are the basics. Let's talk about the actual requirements of the rule. Now, before I can get into those, however, I do have to have one more delineation of the vehicles within this regulation. And that is something that came about back in 2010. Prior to 2010, when this rule was instituted, if you had asked me what the requirements were for a vehicle in the rule, they were all the same. It didn't matter what the weight was, as long as it was over 14,000 pounds diesel in California. They all had the same requirements. But in 2010, our board directed staff to actually separate the vehicles into one of two categories. And they're shown here on this slide. Then they're based on weight. So if you have a vehicle that is under this rule, because it's diesel in California on road and over 14,000 pounds, but it is not more than 26,000 pounds gross weight, then that vehicle would be considered a light truck. So again, if you have a vehicle that's under this rule, but it's more than 14,000 pounds, but not more than 26,000 pounds, it's called a light truck, and your requirements are going to follow the light truck parameters of this rule. Now, if you want to compare that to industry standards, anything that we're calling light is also known as a class 4, 5, or 6 vehicle. The heavy vehicles, on the other hand, are anything over 26,000 pounds. That would be your class 7 and 8. So when you contact the Air Resources Board to determine what your requirements are, one of the very first questions that you're going to be asked, or information that you need to have, is what is the gross weight of your vehicle? Where do you find that information? Fortunately, it's pretty easy for most trucks. In the picture on the left here, you have a tag that is usually going to be on the inside driver's door jamb. I say usually because it's the responsibility of whoever built the truck to put that tag somewhere on the chassis. Usually it is put on that space, but I have seen them in other places as well. I've seen them on the headers of vehicles. For buses that don't have driver's side doors, usually they're right above the dash. I've seen this on the other side of the door jamb, but it's got to be somewhere. And the manufacturer of the truck is another phrase that you need to be aware sometimes can be different depending on what your perception is. So if you were to buy a Kenworth truck, you would be getting that from a Kenworth dealer. They might take a chassis from Kenworth and put it on top of any engine that works with that. And they are building that vehicle to your specifications. So they're responsible for putting this tag on. Now on that tag, it's going to tell you, information about the manufacturer, but it's also going to give you weight class information. And there should be multiple different weight classes depending on what type of information you're looking for. But always there is going to be one of those weight classes that is listed as either gross weight, GVW, GVWR, or spelled out gross vehicle weight rating. That's the number that's important for this regulation because that is the one that our enforcement officers and the reporting staff all follow. They will ask you for that, and they'll also ask you for the model year of the engine. And this has been confusing for people because when we say model year, a lot of people think, well, I don't know, I purchased a 2020 truck. Yes, you did, but that's not necessarily the model year of the engine. The truck and the chassis don't hardly ever match. You most likely have a 2019 engine in a 2020 truck. Since the engines are where the emissions are coming from and they're certified to federal standards based on the year that they were manufactured, we need that information, not the chassis information. Now, where do you find that information? You find it on a tag that's on the engine that is legally required to be on that engine. It's a federal requirement as well as a state of California requirement. The label is called an emissions control label. There's an example of one right here on the screen. This should tell you all the information you need to know about the emissions compliance of that engine, including the engine family name and the model year of that engine. If you don't have one of these tags anywhere on the engine, that's a little bit of a problem because you can get cited for not having that tag. It's a fix-it ticket, but it's still $300 to $500 if you don't have that tag. You want that tag should be somewhere on the engine itself or in the engine compartment. I've seen it on cross members to go over the engine. I've seen it in a little firebox that's next to the engine. I've seen it on the engine in multiple different places. If you find a label on your engine that at the very top of it says important engine information, that is going to be the tag that you're looking for to find the information we're talking about. I should say one more thing about that, and that is if you find that you don't have this tag or it's been destroyed or painted over or something like that, in most cases, you can go to the dealership that represents the manufacturer of that engine, and they should be able to get you a new tag, and they should be able to apply that tag for you. It is typically going to cost you a little bit of money for that, but it's what's required if you want to report to us, and if you ever get inspected by us, it's an automatic citation if we can't find it. All right, so once you have that information, you've determined that you have either a light or a heavy truck. This chart and the one I'm going to show you next are where you go to find out what your actual requirements are. So this is the model year schedule for the lighter vehicles. And it's pretty simple. It gives you one column where you find the engine model year of your particular piece of equipment. And then the second column, which tells you when that vehicle and its engine need to meet 2010 model year engine compliance. What is that? Well, in 2010, federal EPA certified engines across this country, all manufacturers, they had to meet certain standards in both PM emissions and oxides of nitrogen or NOx emissions. And in order to be considered a 2010 engine, it had to certify to those standards. Could not be sold as a 2010 engine if it did not, in most cases. How do you get to 2010 compliance if your vehicle's engine wasn't already there? This has been confusing for some people because everybody that knows about filtration systems thinks that you can just install a filter. A lot of people do, and that's not the case because installing a aftermarket diesel particulate filter does not make that engine meet 2010 model year compliance. It doesn't even really make it meet 2007 model year compliance. No, the only way that you can meet 2010 model year compliance is to do one of several things. You can repower the engine. That means taking the old engine out, putting a new 2010 or newer engine in, and everything that goes with that. You can retire the vehicle, sell it or retire it, or you can drop it down to low use. I'll talk about low use later, but those are really the choices to meet the terms of this regulation. All right. Oh, I should say one other thing, and that is that if you already meet the requirements in this chart for a light vehicle, there's no need to put your vehicle into our reporting system. Your vehicle is compliant with this rule, and this is what our enforcement teams use. They will verify this in the field that your vehicle meets these requirements. For the heavy vehicles, it's a very similar chart. The only difference is that the heavy vehicles were required to install a filter at some point, and then later on meet the 2010 emission standard that I just talked about. So there was an interim step of installing a filter. If you look at this chart, you can see that the last date for installing that filter was January 1st of 2014. So we're 7 years past that. At this point, there are very few reasons why a vehicle operating in the state of California would be compliant if it did not have a filter on it. There are some, and I'll go through those, but very few. Also, I don't want you to forget that there's another requirement that's coming up, and it may have already passed for some vehicles, and that is the requirement to meet 2010 model year compliance. So let's take an example. Let's say I had a vehicle that had a 2006 engine in it. 2006 engines did not come from the factory typically with a diesel particulate filter. In order for me to follow the requirements here, I had to install a filter on that vehicle by January 1st, 2014. And then I've got the rest of this year before I have to turn that vehicle over and either change the engine out, retire it, or drop it down to low use, because that's the 2010 model year deadline. Again, just like with the light vehicles, if you meet the definitions and terms of this chart for your heavy vehicles, you're in compliance with that vehicle, and there is no reporting required if you don't want to. That leads to the next discussion point, and that is that there are ways that you could not be in compliance with those two charts, but yet be in compliance with the regulation. And those were called flexibility options. And at one point, there were more than 20 different ways, different flexibility options that you could apply for and get to make your vehicle still, and your fleet, still compliant with this regulation, but yet you didn't have a filter installed. These were put in place through the regulatory process. We had people from all over the world who participated, especially in the state, and they were inserted into the rule as an option for different types of fleets. Now, the options could have been built around how big your fleet was. They could have been built around what you use the vehicles for. There was a lot of those type of vehicles that had flexibility options. But in any case, two things about the flexibility options. Number one is most of them have already finished their run. They're no longer available because the timelines that they were required to follow have gone past. A lot of them ended in 2018. The second thing is that there are still some flexibility options that are open. Well, they're still being used, but very, very few of them are open to put a vehicle into at this point. I told you earlier that we made some modifications to the rule back in 2010. Well, that wasn't the only time that we modified this rule. We actually modified this rule in 2010, 2013, and then for the last time it was modified in 2014. And in each of those times, the intent was to make the rule more flexible for those people that had to comply with it. We added things to the rule. We extended timelines in the rule, and that was all fine and dandy. The problem is that after the last amendment cycle, the 2014, we were sued by Lawson Construction in conjunction with the California Trucking Association. And that was based on the 2014 amendments. Now, they sued us, and even though ARB gets sued all the time, and typically those lawsuits are specious, just designed to delay, in this case, they had an argument that won the day, and we actually lost this case. Now, we filed an appeal. That appeal took us out till 2018, and like I just said a moment ago, most of the amendments in the rule that had anything that would help people, the flexibilities, actually ended in 2018 anyway. So the effect of this lawsuit was minimal compared to what it could have been. There are a few provisions, though, that did have more extended outcomes. I don't know how far I went. Okay, no, let's go through each of these. So these 5 provisions were in the rule and still being used today, and they all had major modifications that were done in 2014 that the lawsuit made us modify or throw out for at least a portion of the time. Heavy cranes, that's pretty, actually a little bit bizarre, but we created a provision just for what's called a heavy crane back in 2014. And a heavy crane in this case is defined as an on-road single-engine heavy crane, which means it had a gross weight over 54,000 pounds. And it was the type of vehicle that could not haul anything because it had the crane as its main, charge. And the crane was large enough that it had to be operated by a certified crane operator. So if you own a vehicle like that, you are a heavy crane you were a heavy crane under this rule. And because that provision didn't exist prior to 2014, when the lawsuit happened, we had a whole series of issues that come up with this because there were several thousand heavy cranes that had been given more time, and the lawsuit was going to make them go back to what we originally required them. So in this case, what we did is we actually took the language of this provision out of the truck and bus rule. We inserted it into another regulation, the solid waste collection vehicle regulation, that was going through a modification anyway. And the provision is fully intact as it was in 2014. It's just not technically in the truck and bus rule. If you think you have a vehicle that meets those definitions and you don't know whether you are in the appropriate reporting system and under the appropriate requirements, you need to contact our office as soon as you can, because those vehicles are required to be in that provision. All right, one of the other provisions that's shown here that had a little bit of an issue with the lawsuit was something called the NOx exempt areas. The map on the far right shows several counties in orange that, when this rule was first promulgated, met federal ambient air quality standards for oxides of nitrogen. Now, one thing that most people already know, but I'll let you know again, is that the 2010 engine, the main difference between that engine and any engine prior to the 2010 engine is it had an additional control unit for getting rid of oxides of nitrogen. That was its main function. So because these counties were in compliance, we didn't need reductions there in NOx. So the provision for NOx exempt areas is basically, if you own and operate a truck in one of those areas and that's its home, that's where it stays, you can go between counties that are all orange. It just can never come out of the orange area. But if you own a truck like that, you do not have to ever make it a 2010 engine. You do have to filter it, but once it's filtered, as long as you reported it properly and keep reporting it, that vehicle is good to use until whenever. I mean, there's not really an end to the use of that truck. Low-use ag is a provision that was built into the rule from the very beginning. And at this point today, it's in the same form that it was originally, even through the lawsuit issues. The low-use ag applies to any farmer-owned truck that was registered as an ag vehicle. And this allowed you to operate a truck like that for a lot more miles without doing anything to it. Now, today the requirement is no more than 10,000 miles per year on each of the trucks that are registered ag. But as long as you meet that, you don't have to put a filter on. You didn't have to update the vehicle to 2010 emission standards. It just stays as is. You just have that mileage limitation. The low-use exemption is a exemption that is used by, probably it's used more than any of the other ones in the last several years, because it's a refuge of last resort. And I know that sounds funny, but what I'm really saying here is that when somebody's vehicle is timing out based on the charts that I showed you a few moments ago, they really don't have that much they can do. They're not going to be allowed to be registered through DMV. They can't legally drive the truck around anymore, but they don't want to get rid of it. And so the only other options they have are to repower it with a 2010 or newer engine, very expensive to do, or to get rid of the truck, also could be problematic, or drop it down to low use. Now, I don't know if I have any more. Do I? No, I don't. Okay. I want to keep going on this. The low use for this rule is no more than 1,000 miles per year in the state of California. If you can keep a vehicle under 1,000 miles per year in California, then you are exempt from the requirement to filter. You are exempt from the requirement to update to 2010 engines. That's not very many miles. but it is only California. So if you have operations outside the state, those miles don't count. You do have to make sure you account for those in the reporting system, because if you try and report an odometer reading, because we do require that, that shows more than 1,000 miles, unless you can account for miles out of state, you're not going to be allowed to follow the low use exemption. The other thing about the low use exemption that has been used by a number of people is the fact that if you use that vehicle or any of those vehicles in emergency service, any of the miles that you accrue during those service times are exempt from the low use limitation. So I'll give you an example. I have a couple of friends that own water trucks. They're water tender trucks. They're up in Placer County. And they don't use the trucks for anything other than to help CAL FIRE. So these trucks are always on the move to whatever the next fire is. And in any given year, they might put upwards of 50 to 100,000 miles on these trucks. But because their service is exclusively under contract with CAL FIRE for emergency purposes, all those miles are exempt. And they still can operate them without having a filter on them, without having 2010 engines. So that is something that you can use if you have the ability to do that. The last one listed here is the log truck provision, and that's a very specific one to those trucks that are only used to haul logs in and out of the national forest or forestry operations. And you had to have applied for this, and the last time you could have done that was in 2015. But it does allow you to operate a truck possibly for a longer period of time without having a filter on it. This is a provision that they allow the trucks to go straight from what they were from the factory with no filter to a 2010 engine requirement. And at that point, the log truckers usually replace their trucks. But anyway, that one is going to be in play until I think it's 2027 or 2028. All right, that's all the flexibilities. Let's give you a little bit more information. You can go to the truck stop. This is where we're going to have a main page for you to go to get any information about any of the regulations that we have, but in specific, truck and bus is one of the main ones. I told you earlier that if you're in compliance with the truck and bus rule, those charts that I showed you, that there was no reporting required, and that's still absolutely true. However, if you still may want to be in the reporting system. There are two reasons. One is if you're following one of the flexibility options that I just went over, because if you're following one of those, you are required to have your vehicle and your fleet in the reporting system. The second reason that you may want to report is for a certificate. I'll show you that in just a second, but there's a certificate of reported compliance that a lot of people use and need, and the only way to get that is by reporting. The reporting system is all online, and it's open every January. Now, the reporting is supposed to be completed, whatever your update is, whatever you're doing with these trucks, it's supposed to be completed by January 31st annually. And the only time that that's not true is if you make a modification to your fleet in the mid-year time. You have 30 days to make that change in the reporting system before the system will not allow you to do that. The system we're talking about is called Truckers. It's short for Truck Regulation Upload Compliance and Reporting System. And as I said, it's an online system. There are paper forms that if you don't like the online stuff, we can send you. That's a little bit more difficult to work with, but that's what it is. Now, if you have any issues with the reporting system, there's not really anybody you can call. You can call the 866 diesel line, and those young people will be able to help you fairly well, but the reporting staff only operate through email. And specifically, it's that way because there's tens of thousands of trucks in the state of California, more than 1 million in any given day, and lots of fleets. If we had these reporting staff on phones, they would never be able to manage the system. So it's via email only, and they've got it down to a science at this point. Okay, to get into the reporting system, this is the entry point. If you can go to Truckers, let me back up here. On the truck stop page, one of the reasons I show you this is to show you where the link is to get to this reporting system. On the top right-hand side, underneath where I have the address listed, you can see a yellow square, a rectangle that has a mouse symbol and the acronym Truckers. You click on that, it's going to take you to this page. Now, this page is where you would create an account. It's also where you would log into your existing account if you have one. You can also recover your username and password if you have some information, but this is where you would do it. Finally, there are some resources that you can use to help with the reporting and with the regulation if you need. When you log in, to your account, you should see something like this. This is the home page when you first log in. It should list a series of fleets if you have more than one. Most people are just going to have one, and it'll have the trucker's ID number as well as the company name, and it'll have you several options. You'll have a tab for account settings, which I'll show you in just a second. You'll also have the ability to view or update your fleet. You can request to delete the fleet, and every single page should have the last column on here, which is compliance status. That is how you can check to see whether the rule, as you've reported, whether you're in compliance with the rule. Under account settings, I wanted to show you this because this is where you can update the information, the contact information. You can put your current email address in there, and that's incredibly important, as well as your current phone number and somebody that we can contact. If you ever lose your username and password, we use this information to verify who you are. This page is also where you can change your password, which is also important if you have a situation where whoever is doing the reporting for you winds up, not being there anymore. Sometimes people lose passwords. So this is where you can change it and have access to your account. Now, from there, you're going to see where it gives you more tabs. You've got the account home, the message center, the company info, and then you've got vehicle info and compliance status. Remember, I told you compliance status should be there the entire time. We'll look at that in just a few minutes. The vehicle info should show you a list of all the vehicles that you have in this fleet. And each row will be a different vehicle. Now, each vehicle is something that you have entered in, and you have two options. You can either edit that information or you can delete the information. If you delete it, you're going to get a question that says, what happened to the vehicle? Did you sell it? There's several answers that you can give. But the reason we ask for that information is to follow the vehicle, because we've had a number of people try to add vehicles to other fleets. Then they were doing it kind of nefariously and trying to get away with something. So we do need a little information about what you're doing if you delete the vehicle. One thing I also wanted to circle here, I'm not going to show you the tab because I don't have a picture of that right here, but I circled the odometer readings tab under your vehicle list. And if you have vehicles that are following any of the low use options, you just go to that tab, because that tab's only going to have the vehicles that are following those low use options. And it allows you the ability just to enter your information for the year, January reporting, without having to go through all the vehicles and figure out which one's which. All right. Once you believe you've reported everything correctly, you go to the compliance status page, and it'll tell you, the system will tell you whether or not your fleet is in compliance as you have reported. Pretty easy to see. In this case, I'm showing you one that is not eligible for a certificate. That means that the fleet is not in compliance. If you get that message, if you see that red box, I want you to look down below that, because this is a compliance status snapshot, and it'll tell you exactly what we're seeing. In this case, you can see that there's 14 heavy diesel trucks, a total of 15 reported, and if I remember correctly, one of the vehicles that was reported was a hybrid, so it wouldn't be considered diesel. Of those 14 trucks that are diesel, all of them are subject to cleanup. 2 of them are claiming exemptions, and 6 of them have filters towards compliance on this page. Now, 6 plus 2 is 8. That means that you still have 6 more vehicles that need to have filters in order for this fleet to be in compliance at this particular moment that I took this picture. That's not good. That means that the fleet's out of compliance, and that's why it's red. Hopefully you get one like this, where it says click to confirm. And you can see in the compliance snapshot below, we've got 2 diesel trucks, 2 required to report, 2 that are subject to cleanup, and 2 that have filters. So everything's copacetic. It's all good. Instead of having that red box, you're going to get this click to confirm. That click to confirm is not the last step. If you do click that button, it's going to bring up a legal disclaimer that you have to confirm before you're allowed to print your certificate. The reason this is done is because we do not have a system set up where we inspect every vehicle that's in our reporting system. We just don't do that. So in order for us to legally enforce this regulation, we have to have you tell us that what you've put in our system is true. And that's all this legal disclaimer does. Once you do that and you close it, you come back to the screen and voila, it says print certificate and it's in green. You click on that and it should bring up a pop-up window that shows a PDF of your certificate. Now, when that comes up, you can print that as many times as you want. You will not be able to save it in any useful manner because we have had it in the past where you could save it, but there's always some really smart people out there that can modify it and give it to their friends, and their friends were trying to fake compliance. So we don't do that anymore. Anyway, this certificate is interesting to me because it's not used to prove compliance, not for an ARB inspector. If you're out in the field and you're in an inspection set up by the Air Resources Board and you hand them the certificate, that does not mean you're compliant. All that means is you have a piece of paper. We will use the information on the paper to look you up in the reporting system, but we're still going to verify compliance. We're still going to look at the vehicle and determine whether or not it's actually compliant or not. The certificate is there specifically for you to use to prove to other people who want to hire you that your fleet is in compliance. See, that was not the original intention behind the certificate, but that's the way it's turned out. That broker dispatcher requirement that I talked about at the very beginning of class, where I said you have to hire compliant fleets. Well, this is a mechanism that you can use to make sure the fleet that you're hiring is compliant. You ask them for a copy of their certificate. All right. If you need more information about the truck and bus regulation, we do have a page that's specific to that, and there's the address for it. Now I want to talk for a few minutes about what's next, because that always comes up. People always ask me, all right, here's the truck and bus rule. You've got all these other rules. What's ARB going to do next? Well, this is what's next. It's not willy-nilly. It's very well thought out, and we're following a path and a plan. And the plan was to create a series of regulations that had a synergy between them so that one led to the other, and they build upon each other. The first of these regulations is one called Advanced Clean Trucks, and I'm going to be going through that more in just a minute. The second one was something called Low NOx Omnibus. Both the Advanced Clean Truck and the Low NOx Omnibus both have been passed by our board and are in place. The last of these synergistic regulations is the Zero Emission Fleet Rule, which actually has the name Advanced Clean Fleets, or ACF. That one is in process right now. Katie's going to talk about it shortly at the end of this 521 class, and that's got a longer, bigger window of discussion that's going to happen next Tuesday in the MS 555 class. The ACT, or Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, really only had two components. One was a manufacturer's zero-emission vehicle sales requirement, and it's a schedule that they have to follow to bump up their sales of zero-emission vehicles over time. I'll show you that in just a second. The second half of the ACT rule, or Advanced Clean Trucks rule, was something called large entity reporting. When you get into the regulation of the ACF regulation, one of the types of fleets that we focus on is what we call a large entity, and it's a fleet that has more vehicles than normal, more vehicles than small fleets. So we required them, as well as public fleets, to report one time, and that reporting was done last year. Here are the ZEV sales requirements that were part of Advanced Clean Trucks. Starts in 2024 for all classes above 2B, and it continues all the way till 2035, where you can see that you've got some fairly high percentages of sales requirements. Now, will the manufacturers be able to meet these requirements? Actually, all the manufacturers that participated in the process have all told us that they believe they'll be able to do this. So if it turns out they can't, obviously we can jive and juke just like anybody. We can adjust, but this is what's in place right now. The one-time fleet reporting was only in effect for what I called fleets of concern, and they were any fleet that was 50 or more trucks, or brokers directing 50 or more trucks, or any fleet that had a more than $50 million annual revenue, and of course all government agencies. Kind of information we were looking for in this reporting was how many vehicles that they had, of the sizes we were looking for, how they used them, where they were located, the miles they drove. So the purpose of gathering that information was when we were putting the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation together, we're basing what we put in that regulation on the information that we got from this reporting. And that was the good starting point, because we wanted to make sure we just didn't put requirements out there with no basis. Future zero emission rules, we have several that are going to be, that are in I guess they're in line to be done, and you can see them here. They're going to affect all vehicles operating in the state of California, not just diesel. And there's going to be a focus on disadvantaged community effects. And we're considering any and all options right now. Purchase requirements, green contracting, zero emission zones. The whole idea is to transition as much as we can to zero emission and meet our carbon neutrality goals and deadlines, so that we can lessen the greenhouse gas issue. Need more information on Advanced Clean Trucks? Here's their web pages, as well as staff contact. And this is where I pass it off to Katie. So let me get down over here.
Okay. So we're getting close to the end, so everybody just stick with us for a little bit longer. So the first thing I'm going to be going over to today is that we do have enforcement teams operating within California. The California Air Resources Board has two main bases. We have one in Southern California and one in Sacramento, but we also do have contracts with local air districts to enforce some of our regulations in the San Diego area and also in the Central Valley. If you do see an on-road inspector, they're typically going to be working with CHP officers in the field. There are a few ways that CARB identifies non-compliant fleets. The most common is going to be through the DMV registration data. So your DMV registration data is now tied to CARB compliance, and this is really important. So it does actually get its own section a little bit later, so just put a pin in that. Additionally, we conduct random fleet audits where we verify all of the fleet information of a company or an owner and truckers. Sometimes they'll do those if you receive a citation, or if something just looks off in the trucker's account, that can trigger an audit. We also do conduct field inspections. These can happen at weigh stations, distribution centers, truck stops, basically anywhere that your vehicle comes to a natural stopping point, there is a potential to be inspected. Just as an FYI with that, per this regulation and the California Health and Safety Code, an air quality inspector does have the authority to request to inspect your vehicle. If you deny them the right of entry or the right of inspection, that is within your rights, but typically what's going to happen is twofold. One is you will receive a citation for denial of access, and the second is they will actually obtain a warrant, and then when they obtain the warrant, a lot of times what they'll do is instead of inspecting that one vehicle, they'll actually inspect your entire facility. So if the purpose of you denying an inspection is to avoid a citation, it's just, I always just like to point that out because it's a lot more trouble than it ends up being worth. Typically, you're going to end up getting one for whatever you were trying to avoid in the first place, plus a few more tacked on there. So it's really best just to get it over with. I know sometimes it's inconvenient timing and things like that. Typically, they are pretty quick. So if you just allow the inspector to go through with it, it hopefully doesn't last that long. Another thing that will trigger an inspection is complaints. So we do receive complaints, particularly regarding smoking vehicles. State and local agencies are both required to investigate complaints. So if we do receive a complaint about a vehicle, that does lead to an inspection. So what are the ARB inspectors looking for during a roadside inspection? The first thing would be excessive smoke. So they're going to check for that even just as you're driving up. They're going to look at the emission control label on the engine once you're stopped. They'll check for any tampering, and that could include removing the emission control label, or just even equipment not properly being maintained so it's not functioning properly. They'll also look for the illegal use of diesel fuel. So that's when you're using red dye diesel, which is meant for stationary or construction equipment and is subject to less taxes because it is not meant for on-road use. So using that in your on-road vehicle is a violation and can also get you referred to the IRS because you're avoiding a tax. We will also verify compliance with the fleet rules and monitor for excessive idling. There are two things that drive an inspection in the field. So one is if the inspector sees an old vehicle, they'll take a look at that and make sure that it either isn't as old as it looks or that it's in compliance with a flexibility option. And the second is if there's a smoking vehicle, regardless of the age. For smoking vehicles, it's a good indication to us that that vehicle is out of compliance. And the reason for that is if a truck has a filter, it should not be smoking. In addition to the truck and bus regulation, we do have another regulation to minimize smoking vehicles, and that's the Periodic Smoke Inspection Program. This was a program that was put into place in 1998. Inspectors in the field are certified to do visible emissions evaluations on smoke, which means that typically even as you're driving by, they have a pretty good idea of what the opacity of that smoke is coming out of the exhaust even before it's pulled over, and they use a smoke meter on it. Opacity is just the thickness of the smoke coming out of the exhaust, so a higher opacity would indicate thicker smoke. Once an inspector sees a smoking truck that looks to be above a certain opacity, they'll have the CHP officer pull that truck over to do a heavy-duty vehicle inspection for the HD VIP program. A lot of times they're going to use a meter, and that's held to the smokestack to test the opacity of the smoke coming out. That can be referred to as a snap test. They'll have you rev the engine 3 times and see what the opacity of that ends up being. I did also mention the Periodic Smoke Inspection Program, or PSIP. PSIP has the same opacity requirements as a snap test that's conducted by ARB staff, but the PSIP is an annually required test, and it's required to be conducted by the owner if the owner meets the applicability requirements. So if you do have a heavy-duty vehicle inspection conducted by ARB staff, that does not substitute for your PSIP test. We do have the old opacity requirements shown at the bottom of this slide, but these have been updated, and the reason for that is because these numbers are outrageously high if it's a filtered vehicle. In order to be subject to the PSIP, it needs to be a California-based fleet consisting of 2 or more vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating of greater than 6,000 pounds. So if you own 2 or more vehicles, as I just described, you are subject to this regulation. If you own 1 vehicle, you do not have to meet the requirements. The test is required to be conducted on any vehicle that has an engine model year older than 4 years. So if you have 2 trucks and one is 5 years old, the other is 2 years old, you are subject to the regulation, but you're only required to perform the test on the older vehicle initially. You don't have to test the newer vehicle until the engine is 4 years old. So just as an example, let's say the vehicle has a 2019 engine. You will have to start testing that engine and that vehicle once it reaches 4 years old in 2022. When you conduct the PSIP on these vehicles, they have to meet the updated opacity requirements, so not the older opacity requirements. There have been some recent amendments to the on-road regulations. Again, we lowered the opacity limits for both the heavy-duty inspection program that's enforced by ARB staff and district staff, and the periodic smoke inspection limits as well that is conducted by fleets. We also began requiring some training to conduct a PSIP test if you're conducting it internally, and we opened a reporting system to allow the submittal of onboard diagnostics in lieu of conducting the PSIP test. So these are the new opacity limits. This is what they've been lowered to. As you can see, most of the engines that are equipped with diesel particulate filters now have to meet an opacity limit of 5%. This is because if a DPF is functioning correctly, it should ideally be emitting less than 1%. DPFs that are operating correctly are certified to remove 99.9% of particulates. So if it's emitting more than somewhere in the 2% range or so, then there's probably an issue. It could be something like a crack in the ceramic of the DPF or something else going on there. Be aware that a lot of opacity readers are able to read at this lower level of smoke and give you an accurate reading, but unless the software has been updated, the pass-fail readout may be incorrect. So because the opacity limit is lower, if your software is out of date and you get, for example, a 6.5% opacity reading, it may say pass on the meter, but it would actually be a failing result. So just double check that your meter has been updated with your meter manufacturer. Make sure that software is up to date. For equipment that has not been filtered, such as some light-duty vehicles or heavy-duty vehicles that are using flexibility options, the opacity limit for those are based on the engine model year, and they range from 20 to 40%. There are a couple ways that you can conduct a PSIP test in compliance with the requirements. If you contract somebody to do the testing for you, that will typically run somewhere in the $50 to $150 range per test per vehicle. In order for somebody to provide PSIP tests as a contracted service, they do have to have undergone the HDVIP PSIP training course at the California Council on Diesel Education and Technology, or CCDET. That certification is a one-day training course, and it does have to be renewed every 4 years. So please be sure if you contract someone to do this test for you that they do have a valid certification. They have to enter their certification number into the opacity meter in order for the test to be valid. We are still getting some questions recently from attendees on whether these courses are being offered with COVID, and the answer is yes. There are online courses being offered for the CCDET certification. So if you go to the CCDET site, you can find specifics on their class schedule page. The second option you have is for someone inside your company to conduct the test. This is called the direct fleet employee option. In that scenario, you or your employee does not have to attend the CCDET course. The only training that's required is the CARB training course, MS-529. MS-529 is a free course, and the trainee needs to complete any option available to contracted smoke testers within that training. After you complete the course, you'll be emailed a copy of your certificate and a tester number. Again, you still have to enter that tester number into your opacity meter when you conduct a test in order for that test to be valid. So ARB enforcement is active. This regulation is being enforced again at the state and local level. As with any regulation, the reason that we enforce it is to create a level playing field among fleet owners. If we don't enforce a regulation like this, then what happens is the people who are complying of their own choice are at a disadvantage for investing in cleaning up their fleet. So we do enforce this regulation. Currently, the big focus for enforcement is Senate Bill 1, SB 1, which started in 2017. This legislation is what tied vehicle registration to compliance with the truck and bus regulation. We have had the authority at ARB to hold registrations for years, but this was the first implementation of actually doing so. So let's get into SB 1. Again, that stands for Senate Bill 1. A lot of people know it as the gas tax. I'm sure a lot of people at this point have seen the road signs that say your SB 1 dollars at work. The longer name for this bill was actually the Road Repair and Accountability Act. So what you're seeing as you're driving down the highway is the road repair side, and the part that affects ARB is the accountability side. So in order to register your vehicles with the DMV now, the vehicles need to be in compliance with the truck and bus regulation. If you have an engine model year, that has to be reported in our system. If it is not reported and using a compliance option or reported to have a filter, upgraded engine, something similar to that, then your registration will be held by the DMV and you will be unable to register your vehicle until you rectify that compliance issue by reporting in truckers. So our regulation is based on engine model year, but because DMV does not have access to the engine model year, their registration holds are actually based on the chassis model year because they do have that information. So they will assume your engine model year is 1 year older than the chassis model year that's reported in their system. That is what it is. I would say 90% of the time, probably even higher than that. So if you do happen to have an engine model year that is the same as your chassis model year, you can report that into the excluded diesel vehicle reporting, or the EDVR site that Randy went over earlier. By 2023, the only way to register your vehicle will be if it has a 2010 or newer engine, if it's reported as low use in truckers, or reported as a NOx exempt vehicle in truckers. So what if you don't have a 2011 or newer vehicle? So remember, I'm saying 2011 or newer because the engine is typically 1 year older. So what if you don't have a 2010 or newer engine? If you have a 2010 or newer engine, you won't see any of this happening. If you don't, you need to either use the reporting system to claim a compliance option or repower the vehicle. So remember, DMV has access to truckers. So if your engine is beyond the model year schedule and you haven't reported it using a flexibility option, they will hold your registration. If you're reported correctly, there should be no issue with registration holds. Here is some contact information if you do have questions on this material, or if you think of questions later on. The 866 diesel line is staffed 5 days a week, and we also have an email that goes to that staff if you have reporting or compliance questions. So now we'll talk about the GHG, or greenhouse gas regulation. This regulation was passed in 2008 and implemented in 2010, so we're actually over a decade into this at this point. This regulation is a bit unique in that it doesn't actually regulate the emission source of the vehicle. So it's not a regulation based on the engine. This regulation requires owners and operators of specific vehicles to reduce fuel consumption by making the vehicle more aerodynamic. It's based on a program that was started at the federal level called SmartWay. SmartWay is a program that certifies certain equipment by manufacturers that make the vehicles more aerodynamic and fuel efficient, so they use less fuel. So let's, too far. So this is the basic overview of the regulation. Anyone with a 53-foot or longer box type trailer operating in California, anyone that owns, drives, leases, rents, sells, or even is a broker dispatcher for this type of vehicle is required to comply with the GHG regulation. This applies to the trailer and the tractor that pulls them. These vehicles are required to use SmartWay verified technologies and the installation of low rolling resistance, or LRR tires. These tires meet the aerodynamic guidelines to provide low rolling resistance, so less resistance with the road, and therefore increase fuel efficiency. So the general regulation phase-in schedule deadlines have already passed. We're at this point looking at a history of when these requirements were completed. It was phased in based on model year, but again, you had to add various technologies to get the fuel efficiency to increase by a minimum of 5%, and then as well as instituting the use of low rolling resistance tires. If you had a refrigerated dry van, you only had to get a 4% fuel savings and use the low rolling resistance tires. You may or may not have seen a lot of enforcement with this specific regulation, but the reason behind that is because it almost doesn't need enforcing. This regulation, the upfront costs were so outweighed by the fuel savings that we did actually see very high compliance rates with this. You still see the high compliance rates. You'll see this on a lot of the heavy duty equipment that's on the road today. They'll have at least one, normally a few of these aerodynamic systems in place in order to increase their fuel efficiency. There are a couple ways that you can get out of these requirements if you really do want to do that. They're called the local haul and short haul tractor. The local haul tractors can only travel within a 100-mile radius of their home base, and short haul tractor is any tractor that drives less than 50,000 miles per year. So if you're a local haul tractor, you have no requirements under this regulation. If you're a short haul tractor, then your requirement is only the low rolling resistance tires. In order to exercise either of these options, you do have to report. So there is a reporting system with this regulation. So now we'll briefly get into some clean transportation and energy saving projects, which is essentially our incentive programs. So we do have a couple to go over today. I always give the same disclaimer at the beginning of it, which is that there are a lot of these programs that are implemented at the local air district level. And because of that, we do not have the most up-to-date information. So if you do want the most up-to-date information on what funding sources are currently available to you, you will most likely have to contact your local air district. Another quick disclaimer is a lot of these programs require your vehicle to be in compliance already, and then normally at least a year out of whatever your compliance deadline is. So if you want funding and you're going to turn over a truck next year and you want the funding to turn over that truck, they try not to have the funding sources pay for a turnover that would have happened anyway. So you normally have to be pretty far in advance. Sometimes it's up to 3 years I've seen as well, depending on the program. So just be aware of those things going into it, and do contact your local air district if you want to see what different funding is available. So the first one we'll go over is the HVIP program. This is just designed to try to get alternate technology, non-combustion type vehicles into your fleets and into the markets. There are thousands of new alternative fuel technology vehicles coming out, thousands of projects being worked on, being invested in both by the businesses and funding programs. So for this program, a voucher is provided to cover part of the vehicle purchase. They do have a website. We have it on there, the vehicle catalog. And before you apply for funding for this program, I would encourage you to make sure that the vehicle you're looking for is eligible. So the eligible vehicles at this point are almost exclusively fully electric. I think there are 2 vehicle classes where they allow, I want to say natural gas, but just double check. They update the lists all the time, but you want to make sure that whatever vehicle you're looking for the voucher for is eligible. That's again, the website that's on the page there. This one, we did open 2 rounds of solicitation already this year. I think it was $165 million in total. From what I understand, there is going to be, I think, even one more round this year. So just keep an eye out for that. But again, be aware that it only covers certain types of vehicles. So it may have to be a fully electric vehicle depending on the vehicle class that you're looking at. The Truck Loan Assistance Program is at the state level. So this is run through the State of California Air Resources Board. The main difference between this program and the other funding programs is that the money is available for fleets that are not currently in compliance. So if you have an open violation, if your truck is no longer compliant and you need it to be replaced, then you are still eligible for this program. The difference is that it is a loan, it is not a grant, so you do have to pay the money back. The pros of this program is that it is to increase eligibility for the loans for people who may not have otherwise qualified. So you do have to be a small business that operates in California, so 10 or fewer trucks, but essentially the state of California will co-sign a loan to finance a new vehicle if you do not qualify otherwise. We also have the voucher incentive program. This is another program where your fleet does need to be compliant in order to be eligible. It is, again, allocated to smaller fleets, so 10 or fewer vehicles. The vehicles must mainly be operated in California over the last 2 years to be eligible, and it's not typically more than 50 to 60% of the new truck that's covered. So for this one, you contact your local dealer or your local air district to see if there are any eligible funds. Also, just to clarify, if anyone's not familiar with the way funding programs work, there are solicitation time periods. So the incentives aren't available 365 days a year. They're only available during certain time periods. So that's why we say contact your local air district, because it may be early in the time period where you can get your materials together and then you can apply for the incentive when the solicitation does open. But it does have to be open in order for new grants to be selected. If you do need more information on the incentives and loans, we have some websites here. You can join the listserv, and that will send out automatic emails for public workshops, upcoming regulations. It'll tell you about upcoming funds, upcoming trainings. So it's a really great way to stay in the loop. We still need to take Ambrine's contact information off here. Someday I'll remember. She transferred programs, so Ambrine does not work for the incentive program anymore, but Violet still does if you do want a direct contact person. And we also have the additional resources. So if you do have any questions about the truck and bus regulation, we have the diesel hotline available. If you have a complex question about your fleet or an issue with reporting, then you would want to contact truckers at arb.ca.gov. We also have the Truck Stop website, which shows upcoming trainings and has fact sheets. That one's updated pretty frequently, so it's always a good resource to check. And then the smoking vehicle hotline if you do have a complaint to submit about a smoking vehicle. And I have one more small presentation to go through today, and then we will open it up for questions. So these are the upcoming regulations, proposed regulations with the California Air Resources Board. I just want to highlight none of these are currently passed. They haven't passed yet, so they still have to go to the board. They're still in process. They're still being developed. So everything that we go over within this is not a current requirement. It is a proposed requirement. So the first one is the Heavy Duty Inspection and Maintenance Program. This is a legislative requirement that was put upon the California Air Resources Board and the Bureau of Automotive Repair to create a program that is essentially a smog equivalent, but for heavy-duty vehicles. So the vehicles that are over 14,000 pounds, non-gasoline, operating in California, it will require some testing similar to smog testing. The regulation is still being finalized. They just had their last workshop, so the August 3rd date that's on there was the final workshop for this. They are finalizing the draft regulatory language, and it should be available. I believe the draft language is available, and if not, the last presentation, which includes a lot of the information, is available at that first meeting schedule link. They post all of the staff presentations there, so you can review what the requirements are for this regulation, and we'll open it up for a 45-day comment period before the regulation goes to the board for approval, and it is set to go to the board at the end of this year. If you want to sign up for email notifications for this regulation, we do have the listserv. That's the email subscription, and we also have the program website available. Advanced Clean Fleets is a proposed zero-emission fleet purchase requirement, so that would affect public fleets, drayage fleets, and high-priority and federal fleets. High-priority fleets are those that make over $50 million in revenue annually, own 50 trucks, or broker and dispatch 50 trucks. And for each of those, the requirements vary, but it's a purchase requirement, so a percentage of the purchased vehicles would need to be zero emission. And that's for vehicles that weigh over 8,500 pounds. For this one, I think they have another workshop coming up. They did just have the September 9th workshop. If you want to check out the meeting schedule or the previous staff presentations, we have those available at that meeting schedule link. Again, you can sign up for the email subscription at the listserv or view the program website for more information. The off-road diesel regulation amendment, so this is for construction type equipment that's over 25 horsepower and diesel powered. They are proposing a backstop on old equipment for that type of equipment, so phase out of tier 0 through tier 2 eventually for the older diesel equipment. They're also proposing extending the tier ban, which is currently in place in that regulation, to include tier 3 and tier 4 interim equipment, and they are also proposing eliminating the year-by-year low use option. So this one's set to go to the board at the end of 2022. They just had a workshop, I believe, last week, but I think they have another one scheduled within the next couple weeks that are specific to certain types of vehicles affected. So the last one was specifically talking about construction uses, and I'm not sure what the next one is, but if you do want to check it out, we do have the meeting schedule available again, and the staff presentation is also available at that first link. The listserv, again, is to sign up for email subscriptions, or you can check out the program webpage. And the last one for today is the zero emission forklift regulation. This would apply to diesel and spark ignition, so propane forklifts operating in California, and it is a proposal to accelerate the adoption of zero emission technology. The way that they'll achieve that is to have a potential phase-out schedule based on the model year of the engine of those forklifts. This one also has a potential board date of the end of 2022. That's when it's currently scheduled. And the next workshop is tentatively October. I haven't seen an official date come out on that one yet. If you do want to see the meeting schedule, that'll notify you, or sorry, the meeting schedule will show the past presentations that the staff has given, and it will display if they do have a date scheduled. And then the listserv again for email subscription and the program webpage if you do want to look into more detail for that.